So now we go into the topic winds. And in this topic, there's two subtopics, wind and pressure. The second topic is the observed surface wind field. And under this second topic, there's the three subtopics, the scales of atmospheric motion, the general circulation of the atmosphere, and the mesoscale circulations. From 1 to 3, it goes from the large scale to the small scale. Differential heating between the low and high latitudes, that means from the northern hemisphere to the equator or from the southern hemisphere to the equator, the differential heating between these latitudes creates atmospheric motion on a wide range of scales. That means from the very large scale to the small scale. Let's look at the figure on the left. The top panel is for the zonally average temperature and the bottom panel is for the zonally average wind. And in the top panel, we see on the x-axis is the equator. The center line is at 0 degrees latitude, and to the right is to the north, 10 degree north, 30 degree north, 50 degree north, etc. And below the equator, on the left of the equator, is 10 degrees south, 30 degrees south, until the South Pole at 90 degrees. Now on the x-axis on the left is the height in kilometers, and on the x-axis on the right is the pressure in hectopascal. So here we see the temperature variation with height for the different equator, for the different latitudes of the globe. The dashed line, starting from the bottom of this top panel, is the tropopause, with the next line from the bottom is the stratopause, and the third line is the mesopause. So we notice that there are patches of high temperatures denoted by red, and patches of low temperatures denoted by blue. At the equator, where Malaysia is at, we see a large temperature drop from the surface until a relatively low height of 15 or so kilometers, where it is at its coldest temperature compared to the other regions, to the other latitudes of the globe. Then from there it starts to increase again into the stratopause, and from the stratopause it decreases to the mesopause. So in the bottom panel we see the zonally averaged wind. Clearly we see regions of the westerly winds denoted by W and regions of the easterly winds denoted by E, and this is at a height of 60 kilometers, approximately 60 kilometers. In the northern region we see a general westerly winds pattern, but in the southern hemisphere we see a combination of easterly and westerly winds depending on the height. In the northern hemisphere we have slightly weaker westerly winds at a 30 degree latitude at about 10 kilometers above the surface, but at a higher latitude of 50 degrees we have the westerly winds, much stronger westerly winds at a 60 kilometer height. So there's two jet streams at two different latitudes in the northern hemisphere. But in the southern hemisphere we have weaker westerly wind at a 10 kilometer height, and then it goes to an easterly wind at a 60 kilometer height, and another westerly wind at a 100 kilometer height. Now we look at the scales, the different scales of atmospheric motion. In the x-axis is the lifespan or the temporal scale, and in the y-axis is the length scale or the distance scale. So going from the top right, we see the large scale atmospheric motion, which is the long waves in the westerlies. And then as we go down to a smaller scale, then we see the features of a weather map, the highs and the low pressure areas. And this happens within a scale of days to weeks. And then we go to the smaller scale, the hurricanes and the tropical storms, which also last a couple of days. And it's also a relatively large scale weather phenomenon. So the long waves in the westerlies has a scale of 5,000 kilometers, the distance scales of 5,000 kilometers, and the highs and low pressure areas, the highs and low pressure areas has a scale of 2,000 kilometers, which is also known as the synoptic scale. And then the hurricanes and the tropical storms is somewhere in between the synoptic scale and the mesoscale, which goes from 20 kilometers to 2,000 kilometers in size. Then we go into the hour to day temporal scale, which includes the land or sea breeze, mountain or valley breeze, and this atmospheric motion is within a scale of 20 kilometers. And as we go down to smaller scales, we see the thunderstorms, tornadoes, waterspouts, and dust devils, and that lasts between minutes to hours, which has a scale of up to 20 kilometers down to just a few meters. And to the smallest scale of atmospheric motion is the small turbulence eddies, and these last for a few seconds to minutes and has a scale of 2 meters. So looking at the y-axis, there's the largest scale at the global scale, and then a lower scale at which we call the synoptic scale, and then the mesoscale, and then the microscale. And these atmospheric motion goes from the very large scale, and it breaks down to the smaller scales, to the point where it starts to dissipate into the surface, which is the small turbulent eddies. Now we go into the global winds, or the general circulation of the atmosphere. Now if we take all the winds throughout the world and we average it over a very long period of time, let's say for a few weeks or months, then the average that we see is the picture of the winds on a global scale. And the winds on a global scale is what we call the general circulation of the atmosphere. And this scale also goes for a few thousand kilometers in size. Now, the general circulation of the atmosphere is caused by unequal heating of the Earth's surface, such as the unequal heatings of the northern and southern, the north and south latitudes. And this unequal heating causes atmospheric heat transport that creates the general circulation of the atmosphere. Now, in a similar pattern, ocean currents also carry heat from the equator to the poles and back because of this differential heating between the two poles. Now we look at the single cell model of the Earth. Now, with every model there are assumptions, and these are the basic assumptions of that single cell model. The first assumption is that the Earth's surface is uniformly covered with water, so there's only one type of surface and one type of heat capacity, or one type of surface characteristics. So when we assume this, we can assume there will be no differential heating between different types of surface, such as between land and water, so that it becomes a simpler model to compare with a more complicated model later. The second assumption is that the sun is always directly over the equator. In real life, the sun, the Earth, tilts in its axis with the season, which causes the direction of the sun, the direct incidence of the sun to be at different latitudes of the Earth in different seasons. So when we assume that the sun is always directly over the equator, the heat would all just be concentrated at the equator, and the winds will not shift seasonally because of the changes of the direct incidence of the sun at different latitudes. The third assumption is that the Earth does not rotate, so that we don't have to deal with the Coriolis force, and we only need to deal with the pressure gradient force caused by the differential heating. Using these assumptions, we can come up with the single cell model to get a simpler understanding of what the general circulation of the atmosphere will be without these, without other factors. And that single cell model is called the Hadley cell. This is the Hadley cell, or the single cell model. Based on the assumption, we see that in the middle is where it will be hot, and in the left diagram, in the middle is where it's going to be hot, and hot air would rise into the upper atmosphere, and it will be carried southward or northward. Let's use the southern hemisphere as an example. And as it goes to the south, it starts to be cooled, and it reaches a point when it's very cold, and it starts to descend into the surface where it is cold, and it will move from the South Pole to the equator, carrying this cold air. And as it goes into the equator, it becomes hotter, and it gets to be the hottest in somewhere the equator, and it starts to rise again. And that circulation, that pattern, is what we call the Hadley cell. And this happens for both the northern and the southern hemisphere. In the middle is the low pressure zone because air is hot and then hot air rises. And in the north and south pole is the high pressure zone where cold air descends into the surface. Now this vertical motion is highly exaggerated in the vertical. It doesn't go at that larger distance, larger height compared to the size of the sphere. Now because of the circulation pattern, we see on the right, in the right diagram, the different layers of the globe. In the 0 degree latitude, there is the equatorial or tropical region, and between 0 to 30 degrees, between like say 10 degrees north and 30 degrees north is the subtropics, and from 30 degrees north to the 60 degrees north is the mid latitudes, and from that onwards is the subpolar region, and then the North Pole, and this same pattern exists for the southern hemisphere as well. Now we look into the 3-cell model and the 3 basic assumptions. The first assumption is that the Earth's surface is uniformly covered with water, so this is similar to the Hadley cell or the single cell. The second assumption is that the sun is still always directly over the equator, so the equator is where the sun would, where the globe will receive the most amount of energy from the sun. But the third assumption is that the Earth rotates, so this is some added complication to the model. And if we add this rotation factor into the model, what happens to the layers that we saw in the previous single cell model, or the Hadley cell model? If we allow the Earth to spin, the simple convection system breaks into even more cells instead of just the one cell, and that's why we call it the 3-cell model. In the 3-cell model, we see that there is still the Hadley cell, which goes from the hot air rises in the equator and it moves to the north, but this Hadley cell breaks down into the 3 different cells. Using the northern hemisphere example, we see there are winds that move to the left, to the west. That means they're easterly winds, and then somewhere at 30 degree latitude there is the westerly winds, and then above the 60 degrees latitude there's the easterly winds again, and this is mirrored by the southern hemisphere. So in the middle of the equator there's the intertropical convergence zone because of the easterly winds that converges into the equator. And then in the subtropical highs there is a high pressure zone. Oh, by the way, the intertropical convergence zone is the low pressure area or low pressure zone because it is hot. But somewhere in the 30 degrees north latitude is a high pressure zone because it's generally cooler, and that winds are moving from that area to the south, but also moving to the east. But above the 30 degrees north latitude, we see the winds are moving to the east, and this is caused by the rotation of the Earth. In the polar region, there is the easterlies, and it's also at a low pressure zone, and the winds are generally from the east, but at the polar region at the topmost, there's a high pressure. It is a high pressure zone region. So on the left, we see the 3 different types of the 3 different cells. There's still the Hadley cell, the large circulation, and then there's the Ferrel cell above the 30 degree latitude, and then there's the polar cell at the top. Of things to note in this diagram too are the winds that are generated because of the circulation. There's the northeast trade winds that bring cold air from the north, and there's also the southeast trade winds that bring cool air from the south. And then there's the westerlies above the 30 degree latitude, or the north latitude, or below the 30 degree south latitude. And both of these regions move winds from the west. And another thing to note is because of the rising of air at the equator and also at the polar front, these are the regions where clouds are generally formed, and we see a concentration of clouds in this line, at the equator line, as well as the polar front line near the polar regions. Now let's look at the actual situation of the Earth without the assumptions of the 1-cell model and the 3-cell model. There are the semi-permanent highs and lows, or the high-low pressure regions or high-low pressure zones. There's also the Bermuda high zone and the Pacific high zone. There's the Icelandic low and Aleutian low zones, and also the Siberian high. And this is caused by the differential heating between land and water surfaces on top of the rotation of the Earth as well as the tilting of the Earth. This is the average surface winds and pressures of the real world. Now we see there are the high pressure zone areas denoted by H and also the low pressure zone areas. So somewhere in the middle of, somewhere in the equator is the permanent low pressure zones, and it alternates with the high pressure zones and the low pressure zones again somewhere at the top. This is for the month January in the early part of the year. The heavy dashed line represents the position of the ITCZ, and this dashed line, this ITCZ, this intertropical convergence zone line, changes with the tilting of the Earth. So looking at another time in the year, in July, we see that the ITCZ zone starts to move upwards, and also the semi-permanent high pressure and low pressure zones changes because of the change of the tilt of the Earth. Now, the major controls of the general circulation and precipitation patterns of the globe is the position of the ITCZ, and as you saw in the previous two slides, it changes with the months of the year. And there's also the mid-latitude storms and the polar fronts. Though the one that is of interest to us in Malaysia will be the ITCZ, because the ITCZ is the one that carries rain into Malaysia. Most of the world's thunderstorms are found along the ITCZ, and that's the reason why we do get quite strong thunderstorms in Malaysia. Now, just to recap, there's also the westerly wind and the westerly winds and the jet streams, and the westerly winds are the more dominant jets compared to the easterly wind, and it's more permanent than the easterly winds. There are two types of jet streams. There's the subtropical jet stream, and then there's the polar front jet streams somewhere nearer to the top, nearer to the polar region. So this is the position of that westerly wind and the jet stream. We see the equator is where is the low pressure zone, and hot air rises, it goes to the top. It carries some of the energy into the subtropical jet stream, and then it gets cooled and it decreases in height to the surface at 30 degree north. And another cell exists, or the ferrocell, above the 30 degree north, but it starts to rise as it goes northern, and then that creates a concentration of clouds at the polar front. And it also carries energy into the polar jet stream, and it circulates back down to the south. So you can also see the position of the tropopause somewhere nearer the equator, because the violent energy that's created at the equator, it pushes the tropopause to even higher heights at about 50,000 or about 15 kilometers. But as it goes to the northern hemisphere, then the height of the tropopause also decreases. Now, this is an interesting model, the results of a model of the community climate system model. It shows the global circulation of wind for 1 year, and it also shows the changes of the ITCZ and also the other circulation of the globe throughout the year.